The morning everything changed, I was counting nickels behind a cash register, getting ready to close my father's diner for good, when a stranger walked in and smiled at me like he already knew my name. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I had not smiled back at anyone in 6 months. Not at my landlord, not at my mother on the phone, not even at my own reflection in the bathroom mirror when I brushed my teeth at 5 in the morning before opening the diner alone. But when that man walked through the door with the bell jingling above his head, wearing a gray coat too warm for the weather, something in his face made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain. It felt like being remembered by someone I had never met. My name is Maya Ellison, and 6 months before that morning, my father, Daniel Ellison, died of a heart attack behind the same counter I was standing at. He collapsed while flipping pancakes for the Tuesday morning regulars, and by the time the paramedics arrived, the eggs were still sizzling on the griddle. I kept the diner open after that, not because it made financial sense, but because closing it felt like agreeing that he was really gone. The bank did not care about my feelings. 3 days before the stranger walked in, I had received a letter stamped with red ink, informing me that if I did not pay $11,000 in back payments within 30 days, the building my father spent 20 years building would be seized and sold at auction. The stranger sat down at the counter, in the exact stool my father used to lean against when he counted the register at night. He ordered black coffee and a slice of apple pie, and when I set the plate in front of him, his hand brushed mine for just a second, and he said, "Thank you, Maya," even though I had never told him my name. I froze. My name tag was pinned crookedly to my apron, half hidden behind a coffee stain, and I remember looking down at it and feeling a chill crawl up my spine. He noticed my confusion and simply smiled again, wider this time, and said nothing else. He ate his pie slowly, like he was in no hurry to be anywhere else in the world, and when he left, he placed a $100 bill under his cup for a $9 meal and walked out without waiting for change. I told myself it was a mistake. Rich men sometimes did strange things, I reasoned, especially in a town like ours, where old money sometimes drove through just to relive nostalgia from summers long past. But he came back the next day, and day after that. Always the same stool, always black coffee and apple pie, always a tip that made my hands shake when I counted the drawer at night. He rarely spoke more than a few words, but every time he looked at me, it felt like he was searching my face for something. The way you search an old photograph, trying to remember a name you have almost forgotten. On the 4th day, I finally worked up the courage to ask him directly. "Why do you keep coming here?" I said, setting his coffee down harder than I meant to. He looked up at me, and for a moment, his eyes glassed over, with something that looked dangerously close to grief. "Because your father's coffee used to taste like this," he said quietly. Bitter, but honest. I did not know what to say to that. My father had been dead for 6 months, and this man spoke about him like they had shared breakfast just last week. I asked him how he knew my father, and he simply said, "That's a longer story than I have time for today," and left another $100 bill on the counter before walking out into the gray afternoon. Not that night, I could not sleep. I sat on the floor of my father's old office in the back of the diner, surrounded by boxes of receipts and expired permits, trying to understand who this stranger was, and why his smile felt like something I had seen my entire life without ever truly noticing it. I began going through my father's old things, something I had avoided doing since the funeral because it hurt too much. In the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath a stack of unpaid invoices, I found a small wooden box I had never seen before, its edges worn smooth from years of handling. Inside, cards. Dozens of them, spanning nearly 3 decades, each one signed the same way. Still grateful. Still climbing. TT. I sat there for almost an hour, reading postcards from cities I had never been to, places like Chicago and Denver and eventually New York, each one describing small victories in a life I knew nothing about. A first job, a promotion, a wedding that apparently did not last, a company that failed, then one that succeeded beyond anything the writer expected. None of them explained who this person was or why they were writing to my father, but every single one did with the same 4 words, "I have not forgotten." I remember holding the last postcard in my hands, dated only 8 months before my father died, and staring at the return address until my eyes blurred. It was from a corporate office in New York, under the name Thomas Hale. The next morning, when the stranger walked in again and took his usual seat, I did not bring him coffee right away. Instead, I stood behind the counter with the postcard in my hand and asked him directly, "Are you Thomas Hale?" His entire body went still. For the first time since I had met him, the calm, easy smile disappeared completely from his face, replaced by something rawer and more exposed, like I had reached into his chest and touched something he had spent years trying to protect. "Where did you find that name?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I told him about the box, about the postcards, about the words "I have not forgotten" written over and over across 30 years of his life. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, there were tears he did not bother to hide. "Your father saved my life," he said. 31 years ago, on the pier just outside this town, when I was 14 years old and drowning in water I had no business swimming in. He told me the story slowly, like he had rehearsed it 1,000 times in his head, but had never actually said it out loud to another human being. He had run away from a group home that summer, hitchhiked to the coast because he had nowhere else to go, and in a moment of teenage recklessness, waded into water far past where he could stand. A riptide pulled him under. He remembered the cold, the burning in his lungs, and then a pair of strong arms dragging him back to the surface. A young man, barely out of his teens himself, had seen him struggling from the shore and dove in without hesitation. That man was my father. He wrapped me in his jacket and sat with me on the sand until I stopped shaking, Thomas said. He did not call the police. He did not ask for a reward. He asked me my name, told me his name was Daniel, and said, "Every person deserves one person who shows up for them. Today, that's me." Then he gave me $5 for a bus ticket and told me to go somewhere I could build a real life. Thomas said he never forgot those words. He spent years in foster care, aged out of the system with nothing, and slept in a shelter more nights than he could count before finally landing a job sweeping floors at a small tech company in Chicago. He worked his way up, learned everything he could, and eventually built a company of his own, one that specialized in something he only vaguely described to me as systems that help small businesses survive. "I started writing to your father the year I got my first paycheck," he said. "I did not know if he would remember me. I did not even know if the address I had was still good. But I needed him to know that what he did on that beach did not disappear into nothing. Every postcard, every year, I told myself I would visit in person once I built something worth showing him. And I kept telling myself that year after year, waiting for the perfect moment that never came." His voice cracked on the last sentence, and he pressed his palm flat against the counter like he was trying to steady himself against a memory that was still crashing over him like that riptide had 3 decades ago. "I finally flew out here 8 months ago," he continued. "I had just been diagnosed with a condition that gave me, according to my doctors, somewhere between 1 and 3 years. I decided I was done waiting for the perfect moment. I drove to this address, ready to finally shake his hand and tell him everything I never said. And when I got here, there was a note taped to the door about a memorial service that had already happened 2 weeks earlier." He looked down at his hands. "I was too late by 14 days, Maya. 14 days after 31 years. I stood there behind the counter, gripping the edge so hard my knuckles turned white, trying to process everything he had just told me. My father, a man who worked 16-hour days and never once mentioned saving a drowning teenager on a beach, had quietly kept every single letter this man sent him for 3 decades, in a box hidden beneath old invoices, never telling a soul. It broke something open in me, a mixture of pride and grief so overwhelming I had to sit down on the stool beside him, the one customers rarely used because it wobbled slightly to the left. "Why didn't you tell me who you were the first day you walked in?" I asked him. Thomas exhaled slowly. "Because I did not know how to say it," he admitted. "I came here looking for your father, and I found his diner falling apart and his daughter running herself into the ground trying to save it. I did not know if introducing myself as the boy he pulled out of the ocean 30 years ago would help you, or just add more weight to a life that already looked heavy enough. So I started coming back, quietly, trying to understand who you were before I decided what to do next." That should have been the end of the story, a stranger with a debt of gratitude, finally paying his respects to a man who could no longer hear them. But 2 days later, everything became far more complicated than either of us expected. I arrived at the diner before sunrise, the way I always did, and found the front window shattered, glass scattered across the checkerboard floor. My father had installed himself in 1997. Spray painted across the brick wall outside, in dripping red letters were the words "Sell or Else." As I called the police, my mind racing through every person I had ever had a disagreement with. Though nothing in my ordinary life explained that violent. The officer who arrived, a heavy-set man named Sergeant Cole, who had known my father for years, sighed when he saw the message and said something that made my stomach drop. "This isn't the first complaint like this on this block," he told me. 3 other businesses got similar messages the past 2 months. All of them ended up selling to the same buyer. He mentioned a name, a development company called Harmon Coastal Group, which had apparently been quietly buying up struggling properties along our stretch of the coastline, planning to demolish the historic buildings and put up luxury condominiums. I felt sick. My father's diner sat on some of the last unclaimed waterfront land in town, land that had been in our family since before I was born, and someone wanted it badly enough to terrify me out of it. When I told Thomas what happened, his expression shifted into something I had not seen from him before, a controlled fury that made the temperature in the room feel like it dropped several degrees. "Harmon Coastal Group," he repeated, almost to himself. He pulled out his phone and made a call right there at the counter, speaking in short, clipped sentences to someone on the other end, requesting information I did not fully understand about shell companies and property records. When he hung up, he looked at me and said, "I want you to trust me for the next few days, even if what I do doesn't make sense right away." I did not have much choice. The bank letter was still sitting on my kitchen table. The broken window was covered with plywood I could not afford to fix properly, and I was beginning to feel like the walls of my father's life's work were closing in around me from every direction at once. Over the following week, Thomas visited less often, but when he did, he brought a laptop instead of ordering pie, spreading documents across the counter that I barely understood, filled with terms like liens and easements and beneficial ownership. He explained, patiently, that his company had resources most people never had access to, private investigators and forensic accountants, who could trace money through shell corporations most banks never bothered to question. What he uncovered stunned both of us. The Harmon Coastal Group was not owned by some faceless corporation from out of state, as I had assumed. It was quietly controlled by a man named Richard Voss, the same man who sat on the town's zoning board and had, ironically, approved my father's original diner permit 20 years earlier. Voss had spent the last 2 years pressuring small business owners along the coast, using intimidation when persuasion failed, all while publicly presenting himself as a champion of local development. Thomas discovered that the vandalism at 3 other businesses had all been traced back to the same small hired men, paid in cash through an account linked, several transactions removed, to Voss's development firm. "We could go to the police with this," Thomas said one evening, after the diner had closed and we sat together at the counter under the dim overhead lights. "But men like Voss have lawyers who make evidence disappear faster than you'd believe. I have a different idea, but it means being patient a little longer." I asked him what he meant, and for the first time since I had met him, he looked almost nervous, like he was about to ask permission for something deeply personal rather than simply strategic. "I want to buy the debt on this building before Voss can force a foreclosure," he said, quietly, through a company with no connection to my name, "so nobody can accuse you of accepting charity you did not ask for. Then I want to place the property into a protected trust, in your name only, so it can never be threatened like this again." I remember staring at him, feeling a strange, uncomfortable mixture of gratitude and pride wrestling inside my chest. "I can't let you do that," I said. "You don't owe me anything. Whatever happened between you and my father happened before I was even born." Thomas shook his head slowly. "Your father told me something on that beach I never forgot," he said. "He said kindness that stops at one person was never really kindness at all, it was just convenience. He showed up for me when I had nobody. I'm not doing this to repay a debt to a dead man, Maya. I'm doing it because I finally understand what he meant. And it took me 31 years and a terminal diagnosis to actually live it instead of just writing postcards about it." 3 weeks later, everything came to a head on a Thursday afternoon that I will never forget for as long as I live. Richard Voss himself walked into the diner, dressed in an expensive suit that looked wildly out of place among the cracked vinyl booths, demanding to speak to whoever now held the deed to the property. Since his contacts at the bank had informed him the debt had mysteriously been paid off in full. I watched his confident expression crumble as Thomas stood up from his usual stool and introduced himself, calmly laying a folder of documents on the counter between them, evidence connecting Voss directly to the vandalism campaign across 3 different businesses. "You have 2 options," Thomas told him, his voice steady in a way that made the entire room go quiet. "You can leave this town's small business owners alone permanently, or every piece of paper in this folder finds its way to the district attorney's office, along with several journalists who would very much enjoy a story about a zoning board member using intimidation to force families out of properties he wanted to develop." Voss's face went pale, then red, then pale again. He left without another word, and though I later learned there were quiet legal consequences that unfolded over the following months, I never saw him near the diner again. That should have felt like the ending, the neat resolution where the villain retreats and the heroes celebrate, but life rarely wraps itself up that cleanly. And the weeks that followed taught me that even more than they taught me about Voss or the trust or the deed now safely secured in my name. Thomas's visits became less frequent, and when he did come, I noticed things I had been too overwhelmed to notice before. The slight tremor in his hands some mornings, the way he sometimes pressed his palm against his chest and breathed carefully, like he was counting each inhale on purpose. One afternoon in late October, he finally told me the rest of what his doctors had said, details he had softened the first time out of some instinct to protect me from a grief he assumed I did not have room for. "The treatments are managing it for now," he said, staring into his coffee instead of at me. "But managing isn't curing. I've made peace, mostly. I just didn't want you thinking I showed up here to be some kind of guardian angel who sticks around forever. I'm just a man trying to close the circle your father opened for me a long time ago, before I run out of time to close it." I did not know what to say. I reached across the counter and took his hand, the same hand that had brushed mine that very first day, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. The diner was empty except for the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of rain starting against the windows, and I understood, in that quiet moment, that grief and gratitude could the exact same space inside a person without canceling each other out. Over the following months, I reopened the Dopperly, repainting the walls, a warm cream color my father had always talked about but never gotten around to, replacing the shattered window with something even sturdier than before. I hung a small brass plaque near the entrance that read, "For Daniel who always showed up," and beneath it, in smaller letters, "And for every stranger who remembers." Business slowly returned, helped along by the kind of mouth that spreads through small towns when people sense a story worth repeating, though I never told the full details to anyone outside the people who truly needed to know them. Thomas came by less often as it required more of his attention, sometimes disappearing for weeks at a treatments in the city, but he always returned, always sat in that same stool, always ordered black pie. On the day of the official reopening, with new customers filling booths that had sat empty for months, Thomas walked in wearing a coat to the weather, just that very first morning, and smiled at me from across the room. I finally understood, standing there behind the counter my father had stood behind for 20 years, exactly why that smile had unsettled me so deeply the first time I saw it. It was not because I recognized him. It was because I recognized my father in him, some small mannerism absorbed over decades of gratitude, a kindness worn into his features the way water eventually shapes stone. My father had given him $5 and a jacket on a cold beach 31 years ago. And without either of them realizing it, he had also given him something to carry forward, a way of showing up for people who did not expect anyone. Thomas passed away the following spring, quietly, surrounded by people from the company he had built from nothing. Though I was told he kept a photograph of the diner on his desk until the very end. I received one final letter from his lawyer, along with a small wooden box similar to the one I had found in my father's desk, except this one was addressed to me instead of him. Inside was a single postcard, written in Thomas's careful handwriting, dated only a week before he died. It read simply, "Your father taught me that showing up for one person can ripple further than either of you will ever see. I hope you the same thing. I have not forgotten. Neither will you." I keep that postcard behind the register to this day, where I see it every single morning before we open, that the smallest act of kindness a person offers a stranger can travel farther and longer than they will ever know, sometimes crossing 30 years and hundreds of miles just to find its way home again, arriving quietly in the shape of a smile that changes everything.